Well, now that we've had our 30 days for the Earth, where do we go from here? How do we stay informed about our mothership so that we can safely navigate our dangerous and lovely world? In general, I don't get my environmental news from mainstream media because most of it is distorted. So I search the net and print publications for the, quote, real news from independent and credible alternative sources. Sometimes I find good news, but mostly it's bad news. I'm finding more good news these days, but the bad news is increasing rapidly and far outpaces the good. Here are a few items, beginning with one I consider good environmental news, although many Americans consider it bad news. Quote, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously rejected the Trump administration's petition for a court order to drop the landmark climate lawsuit brought by 21 youth. The U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon lifted the stay it had imposed late last year on the trial of Juliana versus United States, originally scheduled for February 5th of this year. The case will now go to trial. The case is one of many related legal actions brought by youth in several states and countries, all seeking science-based action by governments to stabilize the climate system. I found that at rifuture.org on March 8th, RI as in Rhode Island. Some of the most encouraging environmental stories in recent months are the court victories being won by climate activists. You won't hear much of anything about these wins from mainstream news. One example posted on Tuesday this week. Quote, the Minnesota Court of Appeals noted on Monday that 4 pipeline activists, or I should say ruled on Monday, that 4 anti-pipeline activists facing criminal charges can argue the necessity defense. Climate scientists and other experts can now testify about the serious threat posed by global warming. The necessity defense has worked for climate activists 4 times in recent months. Last month, a Massachusetts judge ruled that 13 protesters were not responsible for civil disobedience after they were arrested for blocking pipeline construction. That was posted April 24th at grist.org. Now for some real bad news, not the phony, sensationalized fear-mongering that mainstream media engages in. Quote, this year's ice-free Arctic means the end of habitat for humans on Earth. That so few scientists are willing to discuss either habitat or the consequences of an ice-free Arctic tells us all we need to know about paid scientists. That was posted by a scientist named Guy McPherson at guymcpherson.com on March 9th. And yes, Americans, many Americans, consider an ice-free Arctic good news. Does that make you feel dizzy? See if this real good news provides relief. At present, there are 457 million acres of GMO crops growing around the world. The good news is this GMO acreage has remained largely unchanged for the last 3 years. This lack of growth is undoubtedly a reflection of growing consumer awareness about GMOs and the toxic chemicals that accompany them. In the U.S., the organic food and products sector has grown to $50 billion a year, and the certified non-GMO sector is now at $30 billion annually. That's from drmercola.com, posted on March 11th. Well, what the heck? Let's be profligate and look at more good news. On Friday, April 13th of all days, the International Maritime Organization agreed for the first time to limit greenhouse gas emissions from global shipping. The non-binding deal marks a critical shift for the sector, which until last week was the only major industry without a comprehensive climate plan. Cargo ships are the linchpin of our modern global economy, transporting roughly 90% of everything we buy. They also contribute significantly to planet-warming gases in the atmosphere. With the new emissions targets, observers say the shipping industry now has more than a fighting chance to clean up its act. That was posted April 18th at grist.org. Okay, well, let's not get carried away with the good news. Back to the bad news. For example, according to a recent study published in Current Biology, more than 99% of all green sea turtles born on beaches along the northern stretches of the Great Barrier Reef since the late 1990s have been female. The culprit behind this imbalance? Rising temperatures associated with global warming. As scientists have long known, sea turtle gender is influenced by temperature. Warmer weather produces more females. That's from the spring issue of Earth Island Journal, also on the web at earthisland.org. Speaking of water, what are you drinking? Here's bad news from orbmedia.org, posted April 9th. Quote, tests reveal bottled water contains nearly twice as many microplastic particles per liter as tap water. The contamination is thought to originate from the manufacturing process of the bottles and caps. The worst offender was Nestle Pure Life, the most contaminated sample of which contained 10,390 particles per liter. Orbmedia.org, April 9th. A typical journalistic gambit is to give you the bad news, fully supported by data, and then clinch the discussion with a disclaimer, as in this post of some real bad news about the oceans. Quote, a body of researchers worldwide is working feverishly to find out how plankton will be affected by an increasingly unfamiliar ocean, an ocean that absorbs 300,000 Hiroshimas of excess heat every day, and whose surface waters have already become 30% more acidic since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. One scientist said, no one expected human activity to actually change the pH of the ocean, certainly not at the pace we're doing it, at a pace that far surpasses anything natural that has ever happened. Now, here comes the disclaimer. Despite these whiplash changes, scientists expect that the ocean's chemistry will be restored eventually, even if it takes more than 100,000 years. But no one knows what will happen in the short term. Perhaps evolution or animal physiology will surprise us, keeping up with the dramatic changes afoot. Or maybe there will be a mass extinction. All anyone knows is that everything is in flux. Peter Brannon wrote that at eon.com on February 18th, and that's the British spelling of Eon, A-E-O-N. The problem he's talking about has increased exponentially in the intervening 4 years since he wrote that in 2014. So Mr. Brannon might want to qualify his disclaimer. It's crystal clear where we are going at a headlong pace. Instead of trying to weasel out of the bad news, one website faces environmental and societal collapse head-on and explores it through creative prose, poetry, and art. darkmountain.net from the UK. They have a 12-page manifesto that concludes with the 8 principles of uncivilization. Here are a few lines. We believe that the roots of our crises lie in the stories we have been telling ourselves. We intend to challenge the stories that underpin our civilization, the myth of progress, the myth of human centrality, and the myth of our separation from nature. These myths are more dangerous for the fact we have forgotten they are myths. We will reassert the role of storytelling as more than mere entertainment. It is through stories that we weave reality." Unquote. The stories we tell ourselves. That's why I don't own a television, and why I seldom listen to NPR anymore. I don't want the mega corporation-backed neoliberal party line. I want to listen to radical progressives, like those reporting on people's media, including KPFK-FM, the Pacifica Network, alternative radio out of Boulder, Colorado, Democracy Now!, and many others available on the net, where you can also find my favorite socialist economist on YouTube, Richard Wolff. To learn what mainstream news is perpetrating, every morning I quickly scan the headlines of the e-editions of the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. And of course, there are far more stories on the internet and in print than any one person can keep up with. So I'm sure you have your own sources for authentic good news and bad news. However, we live for the good news. So here are 5 titles of real good environmental and social justice stories from Yes Magazine. Yes, exclamation point. Women reclaim power as life givers. The end of white supremacy, why colonialism is failing right on time. What Standing Rock gave the world. 5 things we need to know about people who live longest. Planting African seeds, harvesting black liberation. For many more stories of people finding their power and helping the environment, go to yesmagazine.org. When Pete Seeger was alive, Yes was his favorite magazine. Their masthead reads, "Journalism for people building a better world." Here are 2 most recent issues. I will put them in the Fireside Room library for you to enjoy. The winter issue is Alternative to Capitalism, and the spring issue is the decolonization issue. So those will be there in the Fireside Room. More encouraging and uplifting good news can be found at grist.org. Quote, "Every year, Grist scours the sustainability space and beyond for 50 innovators doing high-impact work. On our 2018 Grist 50 Fixers, you'll find scientists, policymakers, artists, farmers, social justice advocates, entrepreneurs, technologists, chefs, clean energy wonks, all kinds of people who can help bail us out of our current climate code red. Take a break from the bad news overwhelming your social media feeds and dive into the stories of these amazing, relentless, ambitious, and brilliant people." Grist.org, 2018 50 Fixers. Okay, that's some of the good and the bad. I could go on for hours like this. But the title of today's reflection is Environmental News, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You've probably been bracing yourself for the ugly. What's ugly is that the mainstream media largely ignores these real environmental stories, both good and bad. Here's a quote from the website progressivesites.net. The distinctly conservative slant of mainstream news mainly stems from the business interests of the large corporations that own these news media. Increasing the audience size and keeping advertisers happy are the top priorities. But the political views of the top corporate executives can also have an influence, unquote. So I'm grateful for the reputable alternative sources like Democracy Now!, the Pacifica Network, the Black Agenda Report, DoloresHuerta.org, UFW.org, United Farm Workers, the Hightower Lowdown, the Washington Spectator, UU World, In These Times, Earth Island Journal, Yes Magazine, The Nation, Grist, and many, many more, including laprogressive.com, run by a couple of local Unitarians, Dick Price and Sharon Kyle. You'll find many progressive and environmental stories at coloradoboulevard.net, operated by our very own Wafiq Khalil. I leave you with the words of songwriter and storyteller Ben Weaver, an environmental champion from my home state of Minnesota. You, not the mad kings, are the ones with power. To which I add this caution. You give away your power when you want what the mad kings are selling.
Our closing hymn today is number 108.